thought I was going to be all slick when I had that bass made, and I said, don't put any fret markers on the face of it.
Yeah.
Not realizing that we were going to be performing the piece in the dark.
Oh, no.
So then it's like, you spend, thousands of dollars on a bass that you go out and get these little shiny stickers for at the 99-cent store to stick on your thousands of dollars bass.
Welcome to another episode of Contrabass Conversations, your show covering life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath. So glad to have you here today. And check out our site at contrabassconversations.com for all the past archives going back over a decade, hundreds of guests at this point. And I'd love to hear from you. Send me an email. Let me know a little about yourself, any ideas for the show, any guests. That would be wonderful. And you can reach me at feedback@contrabassconversations.com. I am so excited to bring you today's episode with Michael Valerio. Mike is one of the most in-demand bassists in the Los Angeles studio scene. In fact, if you've listened to any movie soundtrack over the last few years, you've probably heard Mike play. If you've ever listened to John Williams, Hans Zimmer, Danny Elfman, the list goes on and on, you've heard Mike's bass playing. And I've been meaning to interview Mike for years. We actually met nearly 20 years ago, and we talk about that briefly in this interview. He was principal bassist for the New World Symphony, and I was subbing in the group. Our mutual friend Stephanie Payne recently let me know that Mike was coming to town. He was playing electric bass. He was the electric bass soloist with the San Francisco Symphony on John Adams' oratorio, The Gospel According to the Other Mary. And we dig into this piece and the experience of playing it, but I'll just tell you before we start, that part was so challenging that Mike actually had a special electric bass made to be able to play this part. So we talk about that and many other topics, including the experience of studying with Homer Mensch when Mike was a young student, studying with Lawrence Hurst at Indiana University, playing with Roger Williams while he was in the New World Symphony, doing both of those simultaneously, doing the Mancini Institute in LA, which kind of planted the seed about moving to LA, which happened later. Michael Tilson Thomas also encouraged Mike to move out there, and the opportunity that Mike had to meet Chuck Berghofer while at the Mancini Institute. He's one of the most famous bassists you've never heard of, Barney Miller theme, and These Boots Are Made for Walking, among many other things. And Chuck was one of the first people to suggest that Mike move out to LA. And we dig into moving to LA, why that was the right move for Mike, how he got acquainted with the bass heavies of the time in the studio scene, developing the skills to read things on site, and how the studio scene has changed in the nearly 2 decades that Mike's been working there. So many great topics, such a great conversation. I love doing these. It was so great to catch up with him here in San Francisco. And before we get going, I want to take a moment and thank our sponsor, D'Addario Strings. And you've heard me talk a lot about Helicore strings the last few months. I'd actually like to let David White, a former podcast guest, tell you why he likes using Helicore strings. Here he is.
Hey, David White here in New York City. Just wanted to talk for a quick second about the D'Addario Helicore strings. I have the hybrid set on all of my basses, and I am kind of the exact market for that string, doing a lot of theater work. I need something that sounds good, both pits and arco, and they really do live up to the name on the package. They have a great throaty character under the bow. They pull really quickly. They have a great low end response as well when I'm playing pits. I can't ask for a more well-rounded string, not to mention the fact that you can't beat the price point. So it's really a win-win for everybody. You should check them out if you haven't. I, as well as every other bass player in the world, have tried out every string under the sun, and I keep coming back to them. Can't say enough about them. Give them a shot.
Thanks again to Dario for sponsoring. And folks, enter our string giveaway if you haven't yet. Contrabassconversations.com/strings will give you the chance to win a set of Helicore strings. All right, here we go with our interview with Mike Valerio. It might be kind of fun to start and just talk about like why you're here in town.
Okay.
And about the Adams piece and just what maybe just talk a little about that piece.
Great. Okay. Well, the piece is a John Adams piece called The Gospel According to the Other Mary. It's a piece that we premiered in Los Angeles with the Philharmonic under Dudamel back in 2012, and then played it again in 2013, and then took it on the European tour. It's an oratorio that's, based on, the story of Jesus, but it's interspersed with all sorts of other sort of kaleidoscopic material, and it's a very cool piece. It runs about 2 hours and 45 minutes with an intermission.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, it's a long blow. But the two things that are most interesting and apply, one of which applies most to me, is that there are two instruments that he added to his orchestra. One is a cymbalum, which is like a hammered dulcimer, Hungarian style instrument, and the other is electric bass. So I'm playing the electric bass part on this piece, and it's one of the hardest electric bass parts I've ever come in contact with.
You were describing a section of his like quarter note equals 172 or something like that. You're playing like constant eighth notes.
Yep.
That's right. Okay.
It's the opening of the second act where literally all hell breaks loose, and it's just there's a choir that's really belting it out. And all sorts of crazy stuff happening in the orchestration, and he's got this line that I wish I had the music in front of me, but people can't see it on a podcast anyway, so it really makes no point. But quarter note equals 176. It's these running eighth notes that run for about 3 pages in a row. They're all over the acts, and it's because of the range involved and the jumps involved. I play it on a 6-string bass. Yeah, and I had a 6-string bass made specifically for this piece after performing it the first time on a borrowed 6-string, knowing that I wanted it to be something a little bit more specific for this piece. So I had Federa make me a wonderful bass, neck through body construction, flamed koa top that looks like it belongs in the orchestra. They call it fiddleback koa. Oh, nice. That kind of grain. Yeah. And ebony fingerboard, small frets, no fret markers on it, on the face of it, so that it looks like an instrument that sort of belongs in the orchestra. And it sounds great. And it plays really easily, which is the most important thing for me with regard to that part.
Did you shrink the string spacing a little bit? Was there something?
Okay. Federa usually uses a 19 millimeter spacing. Okay. At the bridge, and this bass I have they did with a 17.5 millimeter string spacing, which you can shrink further than that because all of the bridges, the individual bridge saddles are adjustable, so you can shrink it and even tighter to that, which I have done. Okay. Because I need to be able to get to the next string, as easily as possible.
Yeah. Wow, and it's amazing what a difference it's a couple millimeters like that will make on a.
It's the difference between playable and unplayable in the case of this piece. So, and I need all the help I can get.
I love jumping around all over the place with these sort of things. So and Mike and I were talking before we hit record on this, but I'd love to maybe dig into how. Okay, so you're playing something like that. Like, how on earth do you get yourself in the right headspace to perform something like that on that kind of a level?
Well, a lot of preparation time. Yeah, goes without saying. On a piece like this, I really had to figure out how, and it being a new part of a new piece, had to make judgment calls in terms of what to leave out. Yeah, had to make sure all the notes were what John Adams intended in the first place. So just a lot of preparation time on this piece, a lot of slow practice, a lot of right hand coordination stuff, which I often take for granted. But with playing a 6-string bass and the spacing, even though it's a smaller spacing, the distance between playing something on the high C string to the low B string, there's things that I do with my right hand that I wouldn't do on a normal 4-string bass. Sure. Like I'm using 3 fingers and a thumb most of the time to pick the notes, and that's something that comes into play. So a lot of slow practice that just slow enough so that I can analyze what my right hand wants to be doing versus what it should be doing. Okay. And what I need it to be doing. Yeah. So that's a lot of it. The other part of this piece, from a performance standpoint, there are whole movements where I'm waiting, and not playing. There are whole movements that are tacit, and then I've got to come in on something that's really explosive. So the idea of, being able to kind of regulate how much of my attention is full attention. You know, it's I know we talked about this earlier. So Don Green, Dr. Don Green, I got to work with him when I was down at New World, and one of the techniques I use of his is his idea of centering and recentering. But the other concept of his is the fact that you can't stay at optimum attention span focus all the time. You have to be able to sort of know how to regulate that so that you're shifting in and out of focus, so that you're relaxing a little bit for a bit of time and then going back into a focus mode. And I use his techniques, throughout this piece, where there are places where I'm allowing myself to relax because I have to make it through such a long blow. Yeah, where you're constantly having to go back and forth between being on and then long periods of being off.
Well, it's something that level of intensity, and then something that's almost 3 hours. I mean, it's
you can't stay up for 3 hours at a time. That'll just burn your brain out. So that being able to regulate coming and going of focus is important in that piece.
Well, I'm a huge fan of Don Green's books. I've read the Audition Success, Performance Success, Fight Your Fear and Win, and I'm sure everybody has a slightly different procedure for centering and kind of getting into that space. Like, do you have a specific procedure you go through?
Well, it's basically his textbook way of going through it. He talks about practicing centering so that you can get there in one breath. And that's generally, what I'm able to do, where, in one breath, I'm able to relax, focus, and energize and on the specific task at hand. And just, being able to refocus every now and again is really helpful. And I use that on sessions as well. Yeah. When I find myself drifting, or when I know that I need to be on for something, I'm constantly assessing where my brain is at and readjusting and sort of rebooting as necessary.
Well, I'd love to kind of rewind a little bit and talk about just like, and then I'd love to dig into like when you discovered that and working with Don and New World and that kind of thing, but maybe just take us back to the beginning, like early years in music. Your parents are musical, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Just talk about how your journey to ultimately finding the bass.
Okay. Well, this is very simple. My parents are both professional musicians. My mother's a cellist. My father is a jazz pianist and a choral conductor. And they both knew I was a lazy kid, but had great ears, because they had me singing pitch patterns before I could talk. And, of course, the more I do it, the more attention I got. So it was great ear training for a pre-verbal, mind and ears. And they, I started on piano. I sang on children's records. My first sessions were actually when I was about 10 years old, singing on children's educational records. And voice changed, and that was the end of that. But it was around 12 or 13 when they said, he's a lazy kid. He's got great ears. We don't know many bass players that play in tune. Let's give him a bass and see what happens. And they just figured it would be a vehicle for me to do whatever it is that I wanted to do. And they were right. The original scam was they said, well, Michael, if you study the upright, we'll buy you an electric. And that's all I needed to hear. I thought that was a great idea. So I got my first electric for my 14th birthday. And from that point on, I spent most of my time playing and practicing the electric bass, and almost none of my time practicing the upright. Until I got to college, that's when I learned to put in the time.
Okay. What were you playing on electric? Were you playing like what kind of stuff?
Oh, some jazz stuff, some Jocko, Victor Wooten, Stu Hamm was an early influence. All sorts of things. I had the bass in my hands most of the time, and that was sort of my early identity.
Yeah. So then you ended up going to Eastman, spent some time at Eastman, ended up studying with Homer Mensch a bit,
Yes.
kind of during that same time too, right? And then ultimately, Indiana, was that Indiana for your master's? You were
No,
there?
it was the continuation of my undergrad.
Okay.
Because I left Eastman halfway through my undergrad.
Okay.
And then spent some time studying privately with Homer, and then finished up at Indiana.
And I've talked to several people on the podcast that have studied with Homer. I think Rob Kassinger studied with Homer.
Yes.
Kate Nettleman studied with Homer. So like, and wide question, but like, if you think about Homer, like, what are some of the first things that come to mind? Just like as a teacher or musician?
Man. There's many things. I never seemed to be able to impress him with the best I could do with Homer was, he said, "Oh, well, that's encouraging." That's about
Okay.
what I get, out of him. And the minute that it felt like maybe I was making some progress was when it was at my Juilliard audition, and I was walking through the main hall with Homer, and one of the security guards says, "Mr. Mensch, is this one of your boys?" He said, "Oh, yes, Jorge, this is my boy Michael." And I thought, that feels really good. That feels really good, because he's always talking, I've got a boy in this, and I've got a girl in this orchestra, and this. Yeah. Homer was great. I mean, Homer, he had so much rich history in his playing career, as a studio musician as well as an orchestral musician. So he could say, I prefer the Bernstein bowing on this, last movement of Mozart 35. And it's because, he played it under Bernstein, and that was the bowing that they used. I asked him once who his favorite conductor was. He said, "Oh, Toscanini," because he played under Toscanini with the NBC orchestra.
Wow.
So the sense of history, and also the knowledge that just everyone at one point or another studied with Homer.
Yeah.
He obviously had good things to say, and it's attributed by how many students he's got in the business at this point that all loved him.
Yeah.
And one of my great heartbreaks in life was when I told Mr. Mensch I was thinking about Indiana. And he said, "Well, I can't take you as a student anymore, and good luck. I hope our paths cross again." And I cried.
Yeah.
It was an awful, awful feeling. I felt like I had really done something wrong and really hurt this old guy. And I guess I did hurt him by not studying with him. And I know that there was, at that period in time, there was a lot of that going on with people leaving Homer for other teachers or other schools. And I still feel badly about that to this day. But ultimately, Indiana was, I grew up in New York, and going to Juilliard would have been kind of like staying home.
Sure.
To a certain degree. So I needed to do something else, and Indiana was that something else.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And it worked out.
And so then you were working with Mr. Hurst.
Yeah.
Right. And IU. Yeah. What was that experience like after the time, after working with Homer? What were your initial impressions of Indiana?
Well, I didn't realize how much I would miss New York.
Sure.
Having left it and found myself in the middle of Bloomington.
Yeah.
But studying with Hurst was great. Everyone sort of got run through the same meat grinder with him. Mm-hmm. Everyone got the same information, but it was really good information.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we all have different quotes of his. Intonation is a state of mind. That was a real. You don't see the squirrels running around worrying about intonation. It's things that still stick with me, even though I don't know exactly what he's talking about.
It's memorable.
It was memorable, exactly. And there was a great crew of students at that time too. Yeah. Charlie Doremus was there when I was there. John Grillo, Dan Kreckler, who was kicking ass.
I'll bet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a good time.
Yeah.
It was an inspiring time.
For sure. Yeah, that Hurst seems like he had his pedagogy, and he took, like you say, he took people through it, but it was this amazing material and sequence. And you look at those there's that photo. It's kind of like that A Great Day in Harlem photo, that jazz photo. There's like this photo of Mr. Hurst with all his former students. I don't remember when this was taken.
You're kidding.
No, I feel like it was a photo that was taken sometime maybe in the 90s or a little later than that maybe, but it was just this pack of bass players. It was just like people with jobs from all over the world.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I remember talking with Grillo once, who had seen not a resume but a bio of Mr. Hurst, and it was basically yes, played in Dallas under George Schulte, and then it was like Mr. Hurst has students in the following orchestras, just all these places, and it was a testament to his strength as a master teacher. Yeah. And it's funny. I know Kurt Muroki, who's taken Mr. Hurst's place and Kurt said I feel like an idiot after having to fill the shoes that guy left behind.
Yeah, I can identify. But what a graceful person to fill the shoes, and what a great
Kurt's the best. Yeah. He's such a sweetheart, and I'm sure he's doing a great job. And
then New World was the next step for you, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Spent 3 years there.
And you were, I remember, Mike and I were talking earlier, and I actually met Mike at New World, like 1998 or 99 or something. And I'm actually, this is all coming back to me now. I remember talking, you were talking about going on tour, and was it with Roger Williams?
How do you remember this?
Well, I looked up the Roger Williams, but I do remember that you were talking about like going on tour. I just came back, or I'm balancing this or that. So How'd you end up in New World and doing that simultaneously? How did that all work out?
Well, it was, jeez, it wasn't ideal.
Okay,
I will say that, and it wasn't really all that smart. Yeah, because I had hooked up with Roger Williams before getting into New World, where we played a gig together in northern Indiana, and it was just one of those gigs where everything went right. Mm-hmm. It was just the serendipity aspect of things. For instance, Roger, I was told just bring the upright. Mm-hmm. I brought the electric just in case, because I always bring the electric just in case.
Okay.
Roger was complaining about the patch on the keyboard not having enough low end, and I said, Roger, I've got an electric bass here with a fifth string. It might help you out and give you some of what you need. Oh, I love it. Wonderful. Oh, thanks, Mike. And it was on from there. The drummer's bass drum pedal cacked, and I happened to have a set of Allen wrenches that fixed it. Little things like that. Yeah. And the next thing you know, I was doing a 2-week tour with him of all over Northern California. And then he would call me for his gigs, and he'd fly the whole band into wherever it was, and we'd play a couple of gigs and then fly out again. And it was really a great experience. I learned a lot about professionalism and how to always give an audience your best.
Yeah?
Yeah. At the time that I met him, I was 24 and he was 72. And he was still kicking my ass, in terms of the energy level that he was putting out, in terms of just really wanting to give a good show, in terms of thinking about how to make the show better night after night. Yeah, and still thinking about the best way to play a melody, and that was his strong suit. I mean, he could play melodic lines beautifully. He knew all the lyrics to all the tunes. Yeah. You'd see him mouthing the lyrics as he was playing the melody to them. He wanted it to mean something. Just great. But anyway, the problem with doing that simultaneously with New World was that with Roger, I was playing electric bass because it was just easier logistically to get an electric bass flowing in and out of whatever towns we were going to. And so that meant, all right, so I'm leaving New World for a week to go play the electric bass somewhere else. Come back for a week, play catch up for a week on the upright bass, trying to get back to where I was when I left, and then I'm gone again for another week.
Yeah.
And it went on like that for the better part of a year. And it was, if I could have done it all over again, I might have done things differently, because it really did, kind of slow up, my forward motion on the upright
Sure.
at that point in time. And, once I did, luckily it's in many cases, the hard decisions are made for us.
Right.
He went with an all LA band after a while, because it just didn't make sense to fly everyone in from,
Right.
He was
right.
flying the keyboard player in from New York, the drummer was coming in from Chicago, and he and the guitarist were coming in from LA to wherever we were playing. So it just made more sense for him to go with an all LA band.
Sure.
And
Sure.
there was no hard feelings or anything like that. And he just said it's just, logistics and business.
Mm-hmm.
But after that, I really got to work on playing the upright. And it was a marvelous crew of guys down there at New World at the time. And it was so inspiring, because the bass players were generally the first people to hit the building and the last people to leave when it came to the practice rooms. And then we'd go have several beers at one of the local watering holes. And
then bass players? Yeah.
Yep, and then do it all over again the next day. And at New World, I mean, every other week someone was getting a good job somewhere.
Yeah.
Someone was, so it was very inspiring. Probably the most important 3 years of my life was down at New World Symphony.
Really?
Yeah. And for varied reasons. I mean, not the least of which was I learned that I didn't want to be in an orchestra full time, which was the question I had going in.
I'm sure you were thinking that. That's kind of like the path that's set out for you. At least a lot of people would think that.
Right.
Yeah.
That's, okay, so you go to conservatory and you study classical orchestral bass, and then you go to a place like New World, and then you win an audition and get a job somewhere, and that's how it works, So I've always felt like the black sheep, because it didn't work out that way for me. I mean, we had a little jazz group my first year there, where the pianist, who also was the first clarinet player in the orchestra, he got a job in principal clarinet of Utah. Mark Inoue, the trumpet player, who is now principal of San Francisco Symphony, he was the trumpet player in the group. And then Brian Jones was the drummer, who got a gig as the timpani player in Detroit, and I believe Houston after that. And then there was me. So I was like, well, what the hell have I done? It's like, this is silly. I just always felt like I was the odd man out.
Well, so things obviously have worked out like splendidly. So was your ambition still to get an orchestra job at that point? Because I mean, you'd been touring, you'd had experiences, outside of that world. Do you remember like a moment where you said like, no?
How it worked for me was let me see. So it was my second year at New World, and I hit the finals of Cincinnati Symphony, and was still sort of in that headspace.
Yeah.
But spent a summer doing the first half in Spoleto, Italy, and then the second half of the summer I had some time to kill. So I did this thing out in LA called the Mancini Institute.
Oh yeah, sure.
Which is, unfortunately now no longer a program, but it was an excuse to go out to Los Angeles, and I had never been. So I got out there, I met some folks. I met one of the greatest bass players that you've never known, that you know, but you don't know his name. But his name is Chuck Berghofer, and he's the guy that played the Barney Miller theme, as well as These Boots Are Made for Walking.
Okay.
So there's two licks that the Barney Miller theme, I don't know a bass player that doesn't know the damn Barney Miller theme, but no one knew, and neither did I up until that point, who played the thing and who came up with that line, and it was Chuck.
Oh, wow.
And he's turned into a really good friend and a mentor, and I got to spend some time with him. He said, look, with all that you do, you should move out to LA. He was the first person to kind of talk me into it, and it looked like a place from what I saw where I could do more of what I do more of the time. Because at New World, yes, I was playing principal bass in the orchestra, but I was also playing jazz gigs on the side, playing electric gigs, playing salsa gigs and things like that. And there were times, and then the touring with Roger on top of it. I was doing it became very obvious early on that I couldn't be fulfilled exclusively as an orchestral musician. So I needed to find a place where I could do a little bit of everything. But at a high level. And so far, Los Angeles has been the right choice. Because I think if I had moved to back to New York, I would have been pigeonholed as the legit guy or the jazz guy or the electric guy, and it just would have been, there wouldn't have been enough room to sort of mix things up and play in a variety of contexts.
Interesting. I wonder, is it just like a difference between New York and LA?
I think it's a space thing.
Okay.
Just the layout, the physical layout of LA. There is space to create your own thing, whatever it is. It's like you've got, in New York, you're all on top of each other all the time. And there just isn't any space to feel comfortable. You're constantly jockeying for position and for survival. And I think it's easier to have a decent quality of life in Los Angeles than it is in New York. I miss New York, and there are things that it's got that no other place has got.
Sure.
And that's the trade-off of not being in New York is that you're not in New York,
right? Which
is a drag. But Los Angeles has come a long way in terms of being more user-friendly a town, and it's become a real food town these days too, which is great. Lots of great restaurants of all varieties on a really high level.
Moby, if you remember Moby, I read a great article he wrote. I can't remember if it was in the New Yorker or something like that, but he recently moved from New York to LA. And the whole premise of the article was, New York is not a town in which you can fail. Like LA, everybody's failing all the time, which is that, it doesn't apply to you for what you're doing, but it sounds like, but it really got me thinking, like, because even the biggest Hollywood star, then their next movie's a flop. And that's okay. They just move on. And New York, and it was all tied in with the expenses and the culture and everything. It's like, there's just not the space to do that. And it really got me thinking.
Moby also has a great restaurant that he opened up called Little Pine. It's a vegan restaurant.
Really?
In Silver Lake.
In Silver Lake. Okay, cool.
We like very much.
Oh, wow.
And all the proceeds of the restaurant go to animal welfare sources.
Wow.
Which is, another one of his passions.
Since we're talking about Moby and we're talking about arts and everything, on some podcast somewhere, it was an interview, because Moby, that album Play, was spectacularly successful, right?
Yes.
Then the album after that was, commercially speaking, a tremendous disappointment, right? And so he was just talking about how that experience changed him as an artist, and just a fascinating, thoughtful guy.
Right.
Thoughtful guy.
Yeah.
And just another thing about LA, I think I read somewhere, did Michael Tilson Thomas encourage you to move out?
Yes,
also,
he did.
Yeah. Talk about that.
Well, here's how this went down. After I spent the summer at Mancini Institute, I came back to LA, and Michael said, I understand that you've taken a liking to Los Angeles. And he's from Los Angeles originally. I said, yes, it looks like a town that I agree with, that agrees with me. I'm thinking about it. And he said, I know several people out there. I'd be happy to make whatever phone calls you want. You just tell me what you want and when.
Okay.
And he introduced me to David Lowe, who was a contractor that's still working quite a bit in town, who was the first cellist that New World ever hired the first year that New World existed.
Really?
And David Lowe became the second in command for Sandy DeCrescent, who was the biggest film music contractor of all time. And David came down to New World, and we met, and we had a coffee. We had another coffee, and I kept wanting to play for him. And he likes to tell the story because he finds it amusing, that we just kept hanging and talking and hanging and talking, and I kept saying, I'd really like to play for you. Can I play for you? How about now? What about now? Weekend passed. I never got to play for him. He's leaving town. I said, well, but I never got to play for you. And David said, man, if I needed to hear you play, I wouldn't have come out here to meet you. And he hired me basically sight unseen to play on some movie dates and do a chamber orchestra gig that he had booked, and a couple other little things. So I basically spent the month of May of '99 out in Los Angeles doing these various gigs, crashing with friends. At the end of the month, took the LA Phil audition and hit the finals there, which was the best thing that could have happened, because that set me up to do subbing with the orchestra, but it also kind of put a stamp of, like, okay, this guy's not just somebody's friend. He actually won, did very well in this local audition, and so it was like a stamp of approval. It worked out really well. But Michael was instrumental in putting that together, and I'm really grateful for him for that. And but Michael also, I mean, he saw me. I was working with him as his principal player. They happened to do a couple of jazz projects when I was in the orchestra where they relied on someone that could actually play jazz. He knew me on the electric bass as well. I mean, he saw me as, there was a period of time where I was the drummer down there as well, because the percussion guys were not interested in playing the drum set, but I was. So I ended up playing the drum set on some pops gigs that New World did, which was hilarious.
No, where did you play drum set before that?
Yeah,
a little bit. Okay.
My brother was a drummer.
Oh, okay, got it.
Yeah,
okay,
there was that. Yeah.
So you make the move and you head out to LA,
Yep.
and maybe just that and you've were in the finals for LA Phil, so you got that official stamp of approval like you were describing in the introduction with Michael Tilson Thomas, but still it's there's probably a lot of people doing that work, a lot of people wanting to do that work. Maybe just take us through how you got established in that scene those first couple years.
Well, I mean, it didn't happen overnight, but it's also a time that I remember very fondly. I was in a position where, I'd get called as a fill-in guy for a gig here or there, film scoring wise. I'd get a single session for John Williams. David Lowe had a lot of jingle dates and a lot of TV film dates at that period in time. So he would always, every week I'd have something to do for him, and I'm really grateful for him and for that opportunity, because it put something on the calendar, which was great. I took an audition and won a position in the Santa Barbara Symphony, which also helped just put something on the calendar, so I wasn't freaking out looking at a blank page, a snowblind book. So little things like that helped. The three heavy guys at that point in time were Nico Abandolo, who was like the up-and-coming principal that had just replaced Arnie Eggleston as principal for John Williams, and then Chuck DeMonico. And Arnie and Chuck were very, sort of paternal figures in my life. Chuck was like a second father to me. And Arnie, and I also became very close. And the two of those guys both took me under their wing, both taught me a lot about, by example, about, how to be and what to do and what not to do. And Nico was also very kind to me, coming up. And the two major things that happened that pushed things forward for me and really kind of boosted the career, as I told you over lunch, were Ernie retired. And when he retired, he sort of bequeathed his gigs to me. He let the composers that he sits first for know that I would like Mike Valerio to be my successor. And Chuck also did the same thing when Chuck found out that he was terminally ill with cancer. He said, I'm on my way out, but this is the guy that's on the way in. And he told anyone that would listen, and a lot of people that wouldn't listen. He could be that way. They called him the mouth that roared.
Oh yeah.
He's fantastic. Just a fantastic guy. Fantastic bass player, fantastic musician. And I'm also fortunate enough to play on Chuck's bass these days.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, how cool is that?
Yeah,
Oh.
it's another nice thing. But getting back to that early period in time, I was subbing with the Philharmonic a fair amount, like, once, 1 week or 2 weeks a month.
Yeah.
I was playing some really high quality jazz gigs in town, and I was doing a smattering of the studio stuff, a couple gigs here and there, and having that variety and having the space in between, it's about the closest to ideal it's ever been. It hasn't been that good yet.
Yeah.
Now, granted, my needs were less back then.
Sure.
I could afford to make, very little money.
Right.
But I was making enough to survive and make the car payment and the rent payment, and I was happy doing it. Life was a lot simpler back then. But it was really a nice time. That was just fond memories of the pacing of things. And everything was new and alive and exciting, which was just great.
Yeah, that's a great feeling, having that sort of freshness to everything.
Yeah.
And then over time, the studio work's taken a bigger percentage of what you do. And then we were speaking like about 80% upright at this point.
That's
in
about
general.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
And the other 20% of the time, some electric stuff, some jazz stuff, but 80% of the time, really, mostly upright in some sort of symphonic context.
Yeah.
There's been a push in the last several years to have live music as part of a lot of TV shows. So there are several weekly TV shows that I do that might have one bass on them or one or two basses, and I get to do that. There's a show called Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., where it's a one bass job. Once Upon a Time, which is another show that's got two basses on it. Bates Motel is a show that's got one bass on it. What's nice is it's a weekly gig, and it's generally the same amount of people, and or the same folks show up on these jobs, and so it's like a little orchestra that gets together once a week to record on these, and there's 3 or 4 or 5 of them a week. It kind of fills in things nicely,
Sure.
and then you do film work around those schedules,
okay,
things like that.
And you're walking into most of those sessions, probably all the sessions, and you don't know what's going to be on the stand.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And that's a special skill, like just being able to read down what's on the page. Did you always have that skill? Did you develop it? If so, how?
I think for me, I've thought about this with, because I've always been a better reader on upright than I've been on electric. Which seems counterintuitive until I started working on my reading on electric, and I realized that the electric bass doesn't have as many of those guideposts, like hitting the back of the saddle or hitting the nut, to know where you are on the instrument. On the upright, where your arm hits the shoulder when you're going into thumb position, it means that you're going to hit a certain note. So you've got all these guideposts to tell you where you are. The electric, it's just kind of you're free balling it. So when I took an interest in really learning the fingerboard on the electric bass and learning where I was at any time and playing more positionally, kind of just filling in some of the holes in my upbringing on that instrument, my reading got better.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, just because there was context was there under the fingers, and then I can read this. So
that guidepost thing, that's something I think about a lot. I don't play a lot of electric gigs, but I struggle with that on the electric with reading too, just because I feel I have to use my eyes so much more than I want to. Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
I started practicing in the dark.
Really? Okay.
Which has come in handy on this John Adams piece, actually, because it's on a black stage.
Is it?
Yeah, so a lot of the times I cannot see where I am on the fingerboard, even if I do look down.
Wow.
And it can be quite disconcerting.
Especially with a part like that.
Yeah. The other thing is that, I thought I was going to be all slick when I had that bass made, and I said, don't put any fret markers on the face of it.
Yeah.
Not realizing that we were going to be performing the piece in the dark.
Oh no!
So then it's like you spend thousands of dollars on a bass that you go out and get these little shiny stickers for at the 99-cent store to stick on your thousands of dollars bass so that you can see where the hell you are. Ironic, yet a true story. Yeah. I wish I had some of those stickers for tonight's gig, actually. Yeah, they'd come in handy.
This is another thing we're talking about over lunch, but I think it'd be cool to dig into. So we were talking about the experience of actually preparing something like this John Adams piece,
right,
or going and playing a symphonic gig or whatever it might be, versus that studio work, and just kind of how how the different similarities and differences. Like maybe just talk about why do you find it stimulating or satisfying to actually prepare a piece like this John Adams?
Well, because that's what, up to this point, that's what we've been doing all our lives.
Yeah.
Is we've been preparing for whatever the next gig that comes up. You get music in advance. It's this piece. Oh, it's this set of pieces. Oh, it's this piece that I've worked on. Or we're preparing for auditions. A sense of cause and effect, a sense of tasks at hand and problem solving, and using those gears of your brain to move yourself forward, whether that feels incremental or whether it happens quickly. It's how we grow. So you get into studio stuff, and so much of the time, with some exceptions, where we are able to get the music in advance, you're seeing the music for the first time on the stand, and you have to make sense of what it is musically, and you have to come to a very quick piece with it, whatever the music is. But you don't have that sense of working it out, and the sense of accomplishment that comes with that as well. It can really mess you up over time to not have a routine of working on something in your playing on your instrument or repertoire, or preparing for a gig. It's an important part of what we do as musicians.
Yeah.
And as bass players, it being such a physical instrument. There's got to be a sense of working in touch with the acts on a daily basis or weekly basis. And you lose that. I don't know a good way to describe the phenomenon, but it's like you really lose gravity to a certain degree.
Sure.
You're just kind of floating, and you get used to that after a while, but your muscles atrophy.
Yeah.
So it's like, in a sense, it's like being in outer space.
But you're right. It's the thing we spent our whole life doing, right? And working towards something, working towards an event, and then applause, right? Like, event done, move on to the next event.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, versus that outer space feeling. Okay,
right.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's not a good feeling.
Yeah.
And that's why, like I spoke to you before, a lot of the more successful studio musicians always hold on to their live gigs. And at first I thought it was, that's, why? Just in case things dry up. And of course, there's a certain part of that. But I think more importantly, just a sense of connection and a sense of working on things, honing the craft, and having those things to work on as part of your schedule, your weekly schedule, is really good for your head and really important. I wish I had more of that in my schedule right now. I mean, there's things that come up. There are, gigs that I have to prepare for. I've been fortunate. I've gotten to sub with the LA Chamber Orchestra a few times this year because they don't have a full-time bass section right now, and working toward those concerts was really beneficial.
Sure.
Really enjoyable.
Sure.
And the concerts were great. Yeah. Great shows.
As that fresh element to the schedule. That live.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Especially when you're away from it for a while. It's just nice to get back in touch with that. It's, that's right. And it becomes refreshed.
Right. Yeah. How is, so you've been doing this, you're coming up on 20 years at this point, like 99 is 2017 right now. In that, like, just shy of 2 decades, how's the scene changed in terms of amount of work, type of work? What's different?
Well, it's gotten smaller.
Yeah.
The scene has gotten smaller. It's gone from, a freelance market, which was, 4 or 5 orchestras deep worth of people, to maybe an orchestra and a half worth of people that the scene can sustain in terms of full-time employment. There's still, good work to be had, just for fewer people. I think, I don't want to be discouraging and say that there are no gigs, which is what the old guy always says. Don't move here. There are no gigs. Because there's always room for good players. There's always room for good talent. It just means that, like in any case, it means that someone gets moved down the pecking order in order to make room for the new person, which is what happened with everyone that's ever moved to LA.
Right. Yeah.
Or into any scene. There is always room for good players, though.
Outside of talent, let's assume someone is talented, and there's so many specific talents to what you do. That's the kind of a multifaceted thing. But what are some other characteristics that would make people want to call someone back?
Well, you got to be able to get along with people. It helps to have a sense of humor.
Yeah.
Mostly in terms of the studio stuff, so much of it is about staying out of the way. Having the antennae up to know what to do and what not to do without having to be told. And I don't know if that's a skill or if that's just a trait, a genetic trait.
Yeah.
Some people have it, some people don't. We've all known people that are good players but just don't have the radar to be able to know what not to say or what not to play or how not to play.
Yes.
There's always those people, and they kind of weed themselves out of the scene without anyone having to say anything. Just, if you have a sense of those extra antenna, the radar, being able to utilize them and not take them for granted, and hopefully keep those abilities up at a high level. That's important. Yeah. Being able to play within the sound of a section is more important when you're playing for the microphones, because everything is on a closer scale. It's like you're not playing for the back of the hall like you would be on an orchestra gig. You're playing for microphones that are 2 to 3 feet in front of you. So you have to have a sound that has less artifacts in it. The artifacts that come from playing loudly, generally speaking. I hate to generalize, because there's time for all sorts of playing and all sorts of sounds that can be made, but generally speaking, it's a smoother sound. A lot more open strings. I mean, how to get a nice sound on an open G string? Do you have a bass that can do that? How to get a nice sound on a low A flat, which is generally the wolfiest, crappiest note on most basses. Yeah. But there are times when, well, that's what you have to play today, and there's you can't make the excuse of, oh, that's just the crap note on my bass. And every other bass, you have to find ways to finagle the bow pressure, speed, ratio, or what I do a lot, because the A flat on Chuck's bass is pretty remarkably bad. Okay. And all my colleagues love to tell me how bad it is. I think that they like to rub it in. There goes Mike with that A flat. But fingering an octave above the low A flat on the upper A flat on the D string tends to help to solidify it in a way, or to smooth it out in a way of, so a lot of my fingerings are, I'm doubling up and playing that double stop every time I'm playing A flat, even if it's in context of a run or something like that, But, especially if you have to just hang out on a low note for a while, so things like that. The getting along with people, the general professionalism rules apply. You show up on time, which means you show up early. You show up with the proper equipment. and you show up making the proper tones.
Sounds simple, but
sounds simple. Sounds like it goes without saying, but
maybe
sometimes
not.
It doesn't. Yeah, sometimes it needs to be said.
Well, I love your description. I was thinking as you're describing that, like in terms of the playing for the microphones, it's almost like the difference between stage acting and movie acting, right? Where like one eyebrow going up in the movie, makes a big difference,
right?
Versus,
exactly. Yeah, totally. Yeah, and you can get away with a lot more with live playing than you can in the studio. I mean, the sound of many bass sections I've played in on live gigs has been the kind of thing where it can be downright atrocious when you're in the midst of it.
Right, sure.
And you get back, 10, 20 feet, 30 feet, and it actually sounds quite good. Yeah. And that's always been a surprise to me.
All that noise and all that stuff that goes up and doesn't necessarily carry it past the stage. Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's a real different playing modality than for the mic.
Yes, it totally is.
I got one, and thank you so much for taking this time. This is so much fun. I got one more kind of general. It's the only general question I ask. It is just like, go back in time. You can pick an age, 20, something kind of that age, but like give younger Mike some advice. Now that you, with the experience you have now, like what advice would you give a younger version of you?
Oof. This is tough because this goes into the same category as, it's like if you took everyone's problems and put them in a pile, people would generally just pick the same problems.
Sure.
Sure. Yeah. Everyone thinks they want someone else's problems until they see someone else's problems.
Right.
Right. The hell with that. I don't need that. I'll take my own problems. Thanks. So there's a certain aspect of that comes to mind when you ask the question, because, chances are, having to have done it again, maybe I would have done it over again. I think the main thing right now is just, remember to choose music first and the money will come. And if I can continue to remember that, and that's why I'm doing things like, granted they're paying me to be here in San Francisco playing this piece, but it's always at a loss when it's not doing film work that has residuals and
right, of course.
Thing. So, the thing about my situation particularly is that along the ways everyone told me, well, you have to make a choice. You have to be serious about the string bass or the electric bass or the jazz stuff and had I actually listened to any of them and made a choice, I wouldn't have the career that I have.
Yeah.
So maybe what I'd tell myself is, and I came to it later, and I came to it partially through Don Green, because I said, hey, everyone's telling me I gotta, I have to hunker down here and make a choice about. He said, why can't you just choose to do all those things? And it was that simple flick of a switch that was like, oh, wait a minute. So you're saying it's okay to do all these things? Yeah, but it has to be, a choice. It has to be a conscious choice and a definitive, this is what I want to do. Letting it be a very specific thing, be as specific as you can. If I were able to have told myself that a little bit earlier on, it would have saved me some grief.
Sure.
And I think I would have gotten to where I am maybe a little quicker. So there is that.
Wise guy, Don Green. So many ways.
It's just great. Yeah. Really glad I got to work with him.
Mike, this has been great.
Yeah,
thank you so much. Mike, such a pleasure. Thank you so much for talking. Links in the show notes to everything we were talking about. So great to catch up with Mike and do that conversation. I love doing these live. It's so much fun to sit down and talk face to face. It's not always possible, but when I can do it, I just love doing that. So much fun, such a fun time to spend a day. And thank you for listening to this. I hope you're enjoying these. They're a ton of fun to do. They're a lot of work to put together, but it's time well spent, I really think. So we're going to get out of here. If you want to get in touch, feedback at contrabassconversations.com. If you're new to the show, contrabassconversations.com. Dig through the archives. If you're not on the email list, you'll get some sort of notice to please join the email list. If you go to the website, join it. I send out double bass news every week. I offer a Spotify playlist of double bass tracks that I send out. I really try to offer some exclusive stuff just on the email list. If you're not on, join. And if you haven't gotten in touch with me, send me a message. I'm here. I'm approachable. I love hearing people's stories. I love suggestions. That's how we get all of these guests. Today, Mike, that was a suggestion from a friend, Stephanie Payne. That's how pretty much all of these are these days. All right, I will shut up. We will get out of here. And I will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.